Welcome to my presentation. My name is Andre Creel, and I'm going to be explaining how to build and set up a 1/8 scale remote control Nitro Buggy. I'm going to cover quite a bit about Nitro Buggies in this project, but first I want to talk about the picture here on the screen. This is David Runnefolk's buggy. He's a professional racer. This is the exact buggy that he won the 2016 Worlds with, which is a very significant race in Las Vegas. It shifts around the world every 2 years, so it's the biggest race every 2 years in RC. And the reason I bring this up is because it's very significant at the highest levels. Nitro Buggy is the most competitive format in remote control anything. The amount of research and development and work and money that goes into it is extremely impressive. You really dig into it. What you see here, had it not be connected to that particular driver, if you were to buy what you see here in the picture and build it to the exact same spec, it would be worth well over $1,600, maybe up to $2,000, depending on some other things. So it gets really expensive because it is so competitive. So what is required? What do you need to furnish an 8 scale Nitro Buggy from the ground up? The first thing you'll need is a Nitro Buggy Kit. These usually run, $550 to $730, and it's just the race rolling chassis. There's no components or electronics involved, and from there you build up and add things to make it run. Other things you need are a vast array of tools. You'll need a 2 to 4 channel receiver and transmitter, basically a controller. You'll need the Nitro engine itself, which absolutely has to be 0.21 cubic inches, which is around 3.5 cc's, to be legal in whatever class you're racing, unless you're not racing competitively. You'll need an exhaust and a manifold. You'll need a steering servo. You'll need paint for the body. You'll need fuel, obviously. You'll need a fuel bottle. You'll need a throttle servo. You'll need a receiver battery, which powers the servos and the receiver. You'll need a starter box to start the engine. You'll need batteries to run the starter box. You'll need a charger for those starter box batteries and a receiver battery. You'll need a couple glow plugs, which is essentially the turbo glow plugs for the 0.21 engine. It's almost like a spark plug, essentially. You'll need wheels. You'll need tires. Wheels usually come with the kit, but sometimes not. And you'll need a glow igniter, which is to help start the engine. And then finally, the last essential item is a tuning screwdriver to tune the carburetor later on. So really quickly here, you have an exploded view of a Nitro Buggy. Generally all Nitro Buggies have 4 wheels and tires, 4 shocks, a wing in the back, an engine somewhere around the middle of the chassis for weight distribution, and then a rear, center, and front differential. This is an extension of the products required to furnish an RC Nitro Buggy. The picture you see here on the right is a set of 8 metric and standard MIP hex drivers. Hex drivers are the most common tool to be using on a buggy, whether building it or maintaining it or setting it up or adjusting it. It's very useful, and these particular drivers in the picture are very, very well known. But overall, the general requirements would be a 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3 millimeter hex driver, along with a 50 thousandths, 1/16, 5/64, 3/32 hex driver. Also, 2 particular nut drivers, a 1/4 inch and 11/32 nut driver. The 17 millimeter nut driver is essentially just a wheel wrench to put the wheel nuts on the tires. Digital calipers are very crucial because there are lots of elements in the buggy that need to be set to a very specific length. At the very least, one side, the left and right side, need to be equal. For example, turnbuckles. If they're not equal, then the toe and the camber are going to be off across the buggy, and that upsets handling characteristics pretty significantly. Blue thread locker, Loctite, that's very useful. It's not the strongest. Red Loctite is maximum strength. It's basically super glue, but that's not recommended because a lot of the screws, metal on metal, they do get undone. But if you use red thread locker, you will never be able to maintain the buggy, which is required to take screws in and out relatively frequently to maintain it. But I digress. Additionally, you need an X-Acto knife, a little scalpel type thing. You'll need needle nose pliers, and like I mentioned before, the tuning screwdriver is a very important tool. elaborating once again on some optional tools that aren't necessarily required, but they make things a lot easier. They save a lot of time. It also helps prevent damage and preserves the life of certain components. The picture you see here is what's known as a shock shaft plier. Its primary function is to hold 3 and 4 millimeter shock shafts while you build them. Other things it can do is make ball cups into ball ends really easy. That's something you have to do relatively frequently throughout the build. And also there's a 12 millimeter and a 17 millimeter hex on there to hold and tighten things. Other optional tools is a body reamer, which is essentially just a very accurate drill to carve holes into the body. There's flush cutters, which cut straight lines. Are designed for the RC body as well. There's a turnbuckle tool, which helps you change and adjust the lengths of a turnbuckle, which I mentioned earlier is significant because that's how you adjust and set up toe and camber, front and rear. A file is always useful. There's lots of areas where it can be used to improve the overall layout and efficiency and setup of the car. 4 millimeter arm reamer is used to help smooth out and free up the suspension. And as I mentioned earlier with the hex drivers, there's a 2 and a 2.5 millimeter hex driver is the most frequent, so a ball end hex driver would be even more useful because there are some that are at an angle that are very difficult to get to. So a ball end hex driver would allow you to adjust it immediately without having to move other things or take things out. The engine is very important in Nitro Racing. Obviously it's the main factor in performance. The picture here you see is an OS Speed engine, a 0.21 Las Vegas Special Edition for the Worlds, as I mentioned in the second slide. But what will be required for this project is a 0.21 cubic inch engine with a 2 to 3 needle carburetor. This one in the picture is a 3 needle because it has a mid-speed needle in addition to low and high speed. You'll also need a 5.8 to 7 millimeter Venturi. You'll need an air filter, a medium turbo glow plug, a tuned exhaust with a manifold, and a 4-shoe clutch system. The servos are theoretically just as important, if not more important, than the engine and the actual chassis, because without a steering servo you can't turn the car. Without a throttle servo you can't open the carburetor, you can't make the engine rev, so you can't make the car go. With the steering servo, the specification desired is more torque, so 300 ounce-inches is recommended. The reason for this is because it allows the car to hold steering angle in a turn better. It also provides a more consistent steering feel. With the throttle servo, which also doubles as a brake servo, after the throttle is closed, the slide is all the way down, the servo continues further and it hits the brakes. With the throttle servo, it's all about speed because that allows engine response. The carburetor can only open and close, the revs can build up and down only as quickly as the carburetor reacts, therefore as quickly as the throttle servo. So the speed specification is 0.08 seconds for a 60-degree turn, and that's once again preferred. Faster is obviously better, and higher torque is also accepted. The transmitter and the receiver are important because this is how you provide your steering and throttle and brake input to the vehicle. The transmitter itself emits a 2.4 gigahertz signal to one receiver. That one receiver is what you plug the servos into, and it receives power from the receiver battery. So the servo action and power is regulated by the receiver, which receives a signal from the transmitter. The transmitter is very important because this is, like I said, your input, so it needs to be comfortable, it needs to last a while, and as well as there are many settings and options available to help tune the car to your liking. To finish off the introduction here, there are several other miscellaneous products and elements that I have not mentioned. Things like all the batteries involved. There will be a battery in the glow igniter. There will be a receiver battery that I just mentioned. There will be 2 batteries in the starter box as well as the actual starter box. This is how you will start the engine of the buggy. There's also a few other things like an infrared temperature gun, a car stand, a variety of weights of silicone fluid for the differentials and the shocks for tuning options, different springs, different anti-roll bars, mini crescent wrench. There's a long list of things that will be in a later slide. On to the project. Opening up the project, there will be 2 main indisputable assumptions. And the first one is that there's going to be no outsourced work. There's no need for it. It's going to be a one-man project from beginning to end. The second assumption is that all the products and components will be ordered and ready to go on day one. There will be no reactive work. There will be no ordering midway through. There will be none of that. Everything will be up front, ready to go, to be completed over time. To continue with the project assumptions, this list here will be assumed that you already own some form or fashion of each one of these. I'm not going to go into complete detail and explain and name every single one of these, but the reason that I'm assuming is because things like needle nose pliers, a car stand can be improvised with anything, a tuning screwdriver can be any slotted screwdriver. So this list of things is not necessarily something that you have to go out and buy to complete the project. Some of it is relatively specialized, but not all of it is. But for the sake of project complexity, I'm going to assume that these are already owned. The final assumptions for the project is that this list of products will be purchased, shipped, and received by day 0 of the project. This is the core of the project here, and it includes the 0.21 cubic inch engine that we're going to be using, which is a Red's WR7 Diamond Edition Italian engine. Also a tuned exhaust and a manifold to match. The Nitro Buggy Kit we're going to be building is the TLR8 4.0. The transmitter receiver will be the one pictured earlier. The fuel, which runs at $28 a gallon, will be 30% nitro, 9% oil, VP racing fuel. The 2 servos will both be made by Servos. One will be high torque and one will be super speed. And finally, a relatively miscellaneous item but extremely crucial is a secondary quote-unquote crap filter to put in the fuel line as a secondary line of protection in addition to the clunk filter within the tank included in the kit. Overall, there will be generally 8 activities which will be broken into 10 tasks and then further separated again, but they will all be completed by one person, as I said, labeled Worker A, and they're receiving and organize all the equipment and tools, as I said before. We'll be completing the build sections A through H as per instruction, prepare the engine, the fuel lines, air filter, carburetor, exhaust, manifold, everything for break-in and assembly into the engine. We'll be charging, one of the activities will be charging the receiver battery and the starter box batteries. Another activity will be prepare, assemble the wheels, inserts, and tires, followed by binding the receiver to the transmitter, breaking in the nitro engine, and finally tuning that engine and setting up the chassis for a local track in Alvin, Texas. Here we see the flow of the actual project, beginning with the buggy build and then breaking that build into sections. Section A, B, C, D, E, F, and G will be broken into further steps. Those steps are designed and will be initiated in a specific manner, and they're all technically constrained by each other. One cannot be completed before the other. Same with the sections. One section is not capable of being completed before the other. As I stated in the last slide, this project is 100% technically constrained. The engine break-in cannot begin until the buggy build has finished. A couple notes for this break-in method. It's a heat cycle method, so it revolves around temperature of the engine, heating it up to a desired temperature and then cooling it down through operations in a specific manner. And also a progressive buildup of use of the engine allows for a successful break-in. The benefits of a successful break-in is that the performance increases, better fuel mileage, more tunability, higher reliability, and it just overall prevents or extends the life of the engine. So an unsuccessful break-in process is detrimental to all those things, which affects the buggy tremendously. So the initial notes for the break-in method is to never start the engine cold. Always preheat the engine. Starting the engine cold can produce undesirable wear on the piston and the sleeve. Another note is to, while the engine is running, maintain operating temperatures of 180 to 220 degrees Fahrenheit. This is very crucial in the process. And another initial note is when the engine cools down, make sure the piston is bottom dead center or at the very minimum out of the compression area. when metal heats up and cools down, it expands and contracts. So the last thing you want is the piston, the sleeve to contract around the piston. This will produce an unnecessary amount of pinch and undesirable wear. So the first stage of the break-in is to idle for a full tank. Get the engine to idle while running very rich by adjusting the high-speed needle and the idle screw. Idle for a full tank or 15 minutes, whichever one comes first, and then cool the engine down, shut it off, and cool it down to ambient temperatures for 20 minutes. You're going to repeat this 4 times. The second stage is much the same, but rather than idling for a tank, you slowly roll to a quarter throttle. After that, a whole tank, slow, quarter throttle off, cool the engine, bottom dead center, 20 minutes or ambient temperature. Stage 3 is much the same. You're going to spend an entire tank rolling slowly to half throttle and then off, driving in figure eights. After this one tank, you're going to shut the engine off and then move the piston bottom dead center and let the engine cool to ambient temperature or for 20 minutes. Stage 4 is just like that, but different in 2 crucial ways once again. The slow rolls to a third, 3/4 of a throttle rather than a half, and you're going to do this slowly over figure eights over 1 tank and then bottom dead center, let the engine cool, and then repeat this for a second time. The 5th stage is just like the 3rd stage or the 4th stage, but it's going to be 2 tanks of full maximum throttle for no more than 1 second at a time. Slowly rolling to full throttle and then slowly off and then braking. Try and drive figure eights over a large area. After 1 tank, shut the engine off, the piston bottom dead center, and let the engine cool to ambient temperature or for 20 minutes. You're going to repeat this twice. This should produce a desirable break-in characteristics of the engine. Sometime between the 3rd, 4th, and 5th tank, you can begin leaning out the engine slightly. It should be running very rich initially. Sometime after the 5th stage, once the engine break-in is completed, there should be a distinct moment where the engine snaps over to running extremely rich. This means the piston has been seated to the sleeve. It may happen sometime in the 4th stage, after the 5th stage, or in the middle of the 5th stage. That is the signal that the engine is broken in. The next several slides will just be simple illustrations of each build section completed. Build section A is just the chassis with the fuel tank on top of it and the steering system assembly installed and the bell crank also configured. This is an illustration of the completed section B. It builds on section A, demonstrating the technical constraint of this project. They build on top of each other. One cannot be done before the other. In section B, the front differential is built, filled with 5,000 weight silicone oil, as well as the hub carriers, the spindles, the anti-roll bars, the dog bones, the turnbuckles, the shock tower, the front bumper, the A-arms, several things, basically the entire front end of the vehicle. This is what a completed section C looks like. It adds on to section B. This is primarily focused in the center of the car. Not as long of a step, but it's just as intricate and important. The center differential is filled with 7,000 weight silicone oil, as well as this includes the linkages for the braking system and also the dog bone connecting the center differential to the front differential. This is what a section D completed looks like. It's very similar to section B, only it's the rear of the buggy. The main differences are the carriers. The hub carriers are not the same. They do not need to turn because obviously the rear of the car doesn't turn. So the hub carriers are different. There's also a wing in the back and a rear bumper is a different design. The chassis brace is a different design, as well as the rear differential uses a lot thinner oil. It uses 3,000 weight oil rather than 7,000 in the middle and 5,000 in the front. But essentially it's very similar to section B. This is what a completed section E looks like. It's looking like a buggy now, much more than before. Section E is essentially focused on the shocks and the springs, the dampening and the rebound of the car. The front shocks get 40 weight silicone oil and the rear shocks get 25 weight silicone oil. This is what a completed section F looks like. Focuses on the right side of the interior of the buggy. This is primarily considered the radio tray. This is what houses the 2 servos. the receiver battery, and the actual receiver. It also connects all the linkages to the throttle and the brake servo, and generally this is the control side of the buggy. This is what a section G looks like completed, the last section in the buggy build. The picture on the right is a total completed picture, minus the tires to be glued on the wheels. The part on the left is actually section G, which is the left side of the interior of the chassis, which is generally considered the power side. This is where the engine will be mounted, and as well as the exhaust pipe and the carburetor, in addition to the fuel filter. I've already discussed the heat cycle break-in relatively in detail. On the left hand side here, just to help illustrate that, is the WR7 Reds engine. On the right hand side we see 2 pistons and 2 sleeves. Now if the break-in method doesn't produce a desired result or something goes wrong, then these are the 2 main elements to be replaced. They're not actually 2 elements. The conrod and the piston head, the springs, and some other elements within the sleeve can all be purchased separately, but essentially it's these 2 items, the sleeve and the piston, whose relationship is absolutely crucial to the health and performance of the engine. Both the Las Vegas Worlds Edition OS engine in the second slide and the Reds WR7 Diamond Edition engine from the previous slide include carburetors that are much more complicated than the one pictured here, predominantly just because they have an extra needle, but this is more than enough to demonstrate and explain how to tune a nitro engine. The way you tune a nitro engine is by adjusting the needles and screwing the idle screw. Basically, changing the proportion of fuel and air going to the engine is what will produce the desired result, or the highest RPM available to the engine. The idle screw with a green arrow is not considered a needle. It's basically a set and forget setting. Turning it in right to the right clockwise will increase the idle. Turning it to the left, loosening it, will decrease the idle. The low speed needle on the right with the waving blue arrow is designed to adjust the amount of fuel at the bottom end. So when the engine is settled and you give it gas for the first time, that's what's going to affect this, or that's what it's going to affect. The most important needle to tune is the high speed needle, which overall adjusts the amount of fuel going into the engine. This is where the fuel line connects and pours fuel into the carburetor. Adjusting the high speed needle is relatively simple. It's the same as a low speed needle. Lefty loosey makes it leaner, righty tighty makes it richer. It's important because it can only be tuned at the top end. At the very top full RPM is when you'll be able to notice the differences. The reason I opened with the previous 2 engines shown in this presentation being more complex is because they have a mid-speed needle. A mid-speed needle is between the high speed and the low speed, and it makes tuning intricately more complicated. It's very difficult to get perfect, and the adjustments need to be extremely incremental and very, very small. Here we see the 8 activities broken into 10 tasks. Build section A through G has a total amount of time per section and then a certain amount of steps. Now that amount of time is not evenly distributed between the steps. Each step has its own specific process, and some of them have more weight than others. The engine break-in is a significant 350 minutes over 5 stages, as I've gone over a few times. The tuning of the engine shouldn't take more than 30 minutes after a good break-in. The setting up of the chassis is 60 minutes up to 2 hours, maybe even longer, depending on the track and the conditions and all the settings and the desired outcome. Here we have the 8 activities that are once again broken into the same 10 tasks as the previous slide. The time, the estimated completion is still generally around the same, but some of them have quite a significant variance to them depending on the build process, if it needs to be rebuilt, and from experience some things can take a lot longer than they should. Once again, the most significant thing with the largest amount of variance is the engine break-in, depending on the process and how everything goes. the engine break-in is the most significant and the highest risk task within this project. Once again, the CPM is relatively straightforward because this is a 100% technically constrained project, so it's one after another. There is no skipping around or easier way to complete everything. So the variance between the earliest and the latest start and finish times is nothing. Here's a Gantt chart illustration of the 10 tasks and the relative time to one another. Once again, this helps communicate the importance of the engine break-in and the significance of that process in the entire project. I've mentioned a few times the constraints of this project, and that is it is technically constrained 100%. So therefore the activity flow chart illustrated in slide 15 and 16 double as a technical constraint illustration. As an example, I've said a few times, the buggy has to be completely built before the engine can be broken in. Another example is the differentials. They need to be assembled and filled with fluid before the rest of that section of the buggy can be completed. And once again, those are all interdependent to one another. As I've mentioned before in the presentation, the budget is entirely assumed and consumed on day one, basically day zero. So the cumulative budget cost curve will just be a constant 100% all the way across the project. Some of the risks need to be identified. The majority are related to the build in sections A through H of the actual build, first activity. They're relatively insignificant, but they are apparent, they can appear. So those risks are incorrect steering geometry, incorrect suspension geometry, poor shock assembly, poor differential assembly, an incorrect mesh with the clutch bell and the spur gear, and also inappropriate use or misuse of thread locker. The main risk in this project is entirely related to the engine, although it's the least likely, but it's also the most damaging, is a poor or undesirable result from the engine break-in. Continuing on with risk identification, the likelihood and the degree of impact, incorrect steering and suspension geometry, poor shock and differential assembly. These four risks will all display negative handling characteristics in the buggy. An incorrect clutch bell and spur gear mesh will do the same, but in addition to that, it may sound off, and the response will be a little bit off, and those are the most apparent ways to identify it. Inappropriate use of thread locker is more likely to happen, but less likely to have a degree of impact, and this can also translate to negative handling characteristics or potential damage, minor or slightly severe. The most important risk, which is also not very likely but has a very high degree of impact, is a poor engine break-in. This will result in reduced performance, tunability, reliability, efficiency, fuel mileage, and overall increased costs eventually down the road one day. Concluding risk identification, here are the triggers and the response plan for each risk. If the steering geometry is incorrect, it will display negative steering characteristics. On and off power steering will feel off. The response plan would be to trim the servo or rebuild all the steering turnbuckles. Another risk would be incorrect suspension geometry. The way that this would demonstrate itself is in landings or on power steering of the car. It will feel a little off. The response plan is to standardize all the linkages and the droop for the front and rear, left and right. Poor shock assembly. This will be triggered by inconsistent feel. The way to correct this would be to rebuild the shocks and replace the O-rings. Poor differential assembly, front, center, or rear. This would be very evident in the on power and even off power steering characteristics in a certain way that's different from steering geometry. The response plan would be to rebuild the differentials and replace the seals. Incorrect clutch bell and spur gear mesh. This trigger would be notchy acceleration or poor acceleration, inconsistent acceleration. The way to respond to this is to just adjust that gear mesh. Finally, or second to last, inappropriate use of thread locker. This will be triggered by undesirable handling characteristics, rattles, loose parts. The way to respond is to pull out that thread or that bolt and degrease it and reapply thread lock. Finally, a poor engine break-in. This will be triggered by it being very difficult to tune, it not staying on, it dying on itself, off sounds, lack of performance, very poor fuel mileage, general sluggishness. Those would be the triggers. The response plan would be to further break in the engine or even just rebuild the engine, replacing the sleeve and the piston. And that concludes my presentation. I appreciate the attention and I hope you learned something. I'll leave you with this video of myself driving the yellow car about a year ago.
.4